Hey, beautiful people, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, TikTok. I am at Rev Derek Terry. And of course, this video is for my patrons. Thank you so much for your patronage. There's something on my glasses. I can see it on the camera. There's a lot on my glasses. It's been one of those days. Anyway, at the time I'm recording this, the U.S. just pulled out of Afghanistan. There's hurricanes in Haiti. There's just a lot going on. If you're a spiritual person, lift them in light and love. Super excited. We're still discussing one of my favorite books. And it's so crazy because this book is so thin. This edition is only 165 pages, but it's a lot. So we're on chapter 2. Chapter 2, forgot I'm recording. On chapter 2 of The Dawn of Freedom. And it starts with, so if you notice the book, if you're reading the book rather, in the beginning of every chapter, there's a quote, there's a poem, and under it, there's some sheet music. I'm a decent pianist, very decent, not terrible, but decent. And this song is the spiritual My Lord What a Morning. Very famous spiritual, Marian Anderson used to sing it. As a matter of fact, that was the name of her autobiography, My Lord What a Morning. And it's very apropos for the dawn of freedom. Get it? Dawn, morning. It's also interesting that later in the book, when Du Bois is talking about dawn and morning, he uses the spelling M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G instead of M-O-R-N-I-N-G. So that sadness. And it just kind of hit me the first time I noticed that the dawn of this freedom, of course, there was excitement. And, there's a Bible verse, if you're a Christian, weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning, M-O-R-N-G. M-O-R-N-I-N-G. But for the slaves, these Negroes, the anticipation that they were striving for in chapter 1, we talked about our spiritual striving, when it actually came, Reconstruction, which is what this chapter is about. There were some good things, but there was some mourning, M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G. But it starts with the most famous quote from this book, and one of Du Bois's most famous quotes, period. The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. The relation of the darker to the lighter races of men in Asia, in Africa, in America, and the islands of the sea. It's a big one. And it's important, I read the whole statement, because usually we always say the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. But I read about people of Africa and Asia, because Du Bois was already looking, in 1903 when this was published, already looking at a global idea of the world, of colonialism. And those color lines, capitalism, colonization, racism, that wherever you were, race was the construct usually used to keep the have versus the have-nots. So just offer some insight. This chapter is one of the longer chapters, but it's not terribly long. But anyway, let's get into it. This chapter is basically talking about Reconstruction. It is a precursor to Du Bois's famous book, Black Reconstruction, which is historical, but also at this like a history rather but also at the same time a sociological study, and he's giving facts and figures, and it's thick and it's a hard read, but it's amazing. This is the precursor to that book. It's also discussing the relationship between the relationships in America between former slave owners and former slaves and just white people in general. And it starts with the whole idea, quote, that question of Negro slavery was a real cause of the conflict. This is important because Lincoln and his contemporaries, and even people right now today in 2021, when this video is being published, will argue that the Civil War was not about slavery. They will argue that it was about protecting the Union, it was about states' rights, and I always say states' rights to do what? Because when you look at the secession papers, many of them mention slavery outright. We also know that there was Western expansion, and should they be slave states, shouldn't they be slave states? We definitely realize that a lot of what people wanted to happen, even though, I mean, Western expansion, so we're talking the indigenous, the Mexicans, the Native or Indigenous Americans, people, they're already there. But as we expanded Manifest Destiny and all of that, the idea of white men in those areas and what that meant for slavery, or what that meant, should those states be free or should they be slave states? And that was an issue. But Du Bois outright says in 1903, a very, I'm not saying unpopular, but not the norm of that time. Negro slavery was the real cause of the conflict. Black people, according to Du Bois, understood that this war, the Civil War, was about slavery. And he goes back to 1861. Literally, the war had just started. Lincoln was inaugurated 2 months after the war started. Black people had already, black slaves, fugitives, had already started leaving their plantations and going to the military, going to these Union camps. And so then the question came, quote, what shall be done with the Negroes? And he goes on to talk about the idea of what do we do. So there's a couple of things that are centered here. One, the idea that this war is about slavery, ending slavery. Black people saw fighting in this war as fighting for their freedom. But it's also a centering of humanity or property, right? Because what do we do with the Negro? Some honestly believed, and he talks about this in the book early on, that these fugitives were returned to their slave owners because they were property, right? But then we have to, eventually we come to the fact where they understand that during this war, these slaves are an asset. They're building trenches. They're taking care of the officers and soldiers. And it becomes prudent to keep them from serving or being returned because they're an asset. And not just men who fought, but women and children. I mean, you look at some of the freedmen's, I prefer the word freed people, but historical was Freedmen's Bureau. You look at some of those camps, they were mostly women and children. Women were washing and providing, all kinds of labor and help to soldiers. Of course, we know Harriet Tubman famously was a spy and fought in the war. And so that's really important to understand that's when we started talking about this conversation of the humanization or humanizing these 3/5 of a human, humanizing them and seeing them not just as war contraband, but as humans. And that's important. Looking at my notes. Also, we have to understand Du Bois glosses over the Emancipation Proclamation. I mean, he mentions it, but the way he mentions it, I really love, because he reminds us it really didn't do anything. I mean, it was a proclamation. It was an executive order. It says, we're going to free these slaves. And so in theory, it had not a lot of power. It actually created, Du Bois would say, like, more conflict, right? Like, what happens here, and of course, as a historian, I've read a lot of books about Lincoln and, the draft, sending within his own party and cabinet, how he wrestled with it. But what it did was it provided incentive for Black people to flee, to leave, to come to those camps. And it did create somewhat of a problem, because you have all these people, and what do we do? Again, quote, what shall we do with the Negro? And Du Bois talked about the Freedmen's Bureau and Reconstruction had a task of creating social, political, and economic base for Black people. Life, liberty, property. I know we say the pursuit of happiness, but in Du Bois' mind, life, liberty, and property, because those things would garner and would create this freedom. According to Du Bois, Black people needed economics, labor, politics, the vote, culture, education, art, dignity, fashion, and don't think, when I say fashion, don't think superficial, but the whole idea of what are those markers of culture? What are those markers of somebodyness? And that true freedom is not just no longer being enslaved. True freedom is freedom of thought, freedom to earn your own wage, freedom to own and control your own property, to educate yourself and your children, freedom to then have the time to learn and appreciate and create art and culture. And freedom is a process. And so of the dawning of freedom, this chapter, Du Bois gives us a historical, sociological account of the Freedmen's Bureau, the Freed People's Bureau, their successes, and a lot of their failures. He doesn't romanticize what they did. There were some good things, and there were some trashy things, and some of the people who worked for them were good, and some of the people who worked for them were not invested in Black people. He never says the Reconstruction failed, but he does talk about the fact that it did not create what it should have created. That after 256 years of slavery in our country, the country owed something to those individuals who built the country for free. And the failure of Black people not getting their land, their reparation, their opportunity to get on their feet, the failure of the Freedmen's Bureau closing, selling out, and allowing the terror and trauma of desegregation to spring up is a failure of our country. And that was wrong. And Du Bois talks about that. Because he talks like, of the dawning of freedom, like when I think of what is dawn, dawn is not something that's instant. Dawn is a process, you know? So darkness gives way to light, colors change. Eventually you see the sun. There may be clouds. It takes a while. It's not instant. But the Freedmen's Bureau only had, what, 10, 12 years? It really didn't have the opportunity to do the work, to make the investment. And because it wasn't fixed overnight, people gave up on it. And black people found themselves in a new form of slavery. A couple of quotes, a couple of things that to look at. That this whole quote, the opposition to Negro education in the South was at first bitter, and it showed itself in ashes, insult, and blood. For the South believed an educated Negro to be a dangerous Negro. Education is so important to the boys. He talks about it in every freaking chapter, just about, or there's a shadow of it in every chapter. And this is one of the things that he says that the Freedmen's Bureau did right, which is establish public education, establish banks, establish these type of institutions for black people in the South specifically. But it's important to know that the individuals in those areas who, those former slave owners, those former power brokers, were actively working against these investments, actively working against these educating these Negroes. He also talks about what happened as black people were trying to work out their freedom. The former slaves were intimidated, beaten, raped, and butchered by angry and revengeful men. Almost every law and method ingenuity could devise was employed by the legislatures to reduce the Negroes' serfdom, to make them the slaves of the state, if not of individual owners, while the Bureau officials too often were found striving to put the bottom rail on top and give the freedmen a power and independence which they could not yet use. Again, freedom is a process, so it's not just, okay, here's your land, here's some money. It's helping them. It's in Human Services 2021 language, it's case management. And because those things failed, it created within, according to Du Bois, black people, it didn't give them the tools needed to be free. They didn't learn how to manage money or what to do with it or how to save, right? And then some of the things like the crash of banks and other things further separated black people from how to live, how to survive. And unfortunately, we see some of these things today. I'm in my late 30s. Did I say that? Oh, I really am. Mid to late, closer to late. I have friends that, like, all my parents didn't teach me about credit. My parents didn't teach me about saving. My parents didn't do this. Well, a lot of them, they didn't know. They didn't have the resources or help themselves. And this is something, you know, we look at generational wealth. This is something that still stains and still hurts us. A thrift among black folk, which slavery had kept them from knowing. Then, in one sad day, came the crash. All the hard-earned dollars of the freedmen disappeared. But that was the least of the loss. All the faith in saving went too, and much of the faith in men. And that was a loss to a nation, which today sneers at Negroes' shiftlessness, has never yet been made good. We also should understand that A lot of this wealth and investment in the Freedmen's Bureau and institutions that we're talking about came from black people directly. A lot of them took their earnings from fighting in the war on the side of the Union, and they used those to reinvest in themselves and in their communities. And they fought for their freedom. They saved for their freedom. They invested. They wanted full participation in the country that they had built, and the country denied them that. And not only denied them, but used the laws and the powers of legislation to disenfranchise them, to maneuver, to literally lead them away. So Du Bois talked about the Freedmen's Bureau failed and was replaced by the 15th Amendment, which gave all men, black, white, or otherwise, the ability, well, in not in theory, the right to vote. But then we saw the rise of those Jim Crow laws in the South that kept them from voting. Let's see. Here's another good one. It was rather a choice between suffrage and slavery. Not a single Southern legislature stood ready to admit a Negro under any condition to the polls. Not a single Southern legislature believed free Negro labor was possible without a system of restrictions that took all the freedoms away. There was scarcely a white man in the South who did not honestly regard emancipation as a crime and its practical nullification as a duty. The very least, a guilty, in such a situation, the granting of the ballot to the black man was a necessity. The very least a guilty nation could grant a wrong race. Du Bois believed in the power of the vote. Du Bois believed in the power of education. Those are two things that were often stripped from black people. And even those schools that did exist, too often, eventually it became a class thing. Even the school he went to, Fisk, were often full of mulattoes who would call mixed race people, like himself, who the children of former slaves whose parents or father, slave owner, may make it possible for them to go to college. That proximity to whiteness. That's where we see the colorism coming in. Let's see. Yep, so the Freedmen's Bureau died and its child was the 15th Amendment, which was the vote. Here's the end. And it's a long quote, but it's so important, and I read it and I get emotional. For this much all men know, despite compromise, war, and struggle, the Negro is not free. In the backwoods of the Gulf states for miles and miles, he may not leave the plantation of his birth. In well nigh the whole rural South of the black farmers are peons, bound by law and custom to an economic slavery from which the only escape is death or the penitentiary. In the most cultured sections of the cities of the South, the Negroes are a segregated, servile caste with restricted rights and privileges before the courts, both in law and custom. They stand on a different and peculiar basis. Taxation without representation is the rule of their political life. And the result of all of this, and in nature, must have been lawlessness and crime. That is the large legacy of the Freedmen's Bureau, the work it did not do. For as much as all men know, despite compromise, war, and struggle, the Negro is not free. And it affects me that way because in 2021, in many ways, Black people, brown people, poor people still aren't free. I mean, we just saw with COVID, who was disproportionately impacted. In the very day that the study came out that more Black people died of COVID, I said, this happened while we were shut down. And I remember saying, oh, shutdown's over. Like, because that in this country is to be expected, is considered normal. Like any good statistic, non-Black, brown people have a higher rate. Any bad statistic, it always hurts us more. Despite compromise, war, and struggle, the Negro still is not free. Look at Black and poor neighborhoods all across the country. Where's the crime? Where are the food deserts? Where are 10 liquor stores and no grocery stores? And all that, and all of that, people will have so much to say, and the result of all this and in nature must have been lawlessness and crime. And you wonder why. Like literally, factories are pumping poison into people's breathing, into people's air. We in this country can look at zip codes and predict a person's longevity or life expectancy, because depending on their zip code, depends on the water, the air, policing. If there are no jobs in your neighborhood, there's no food in your neighborhood. If you can literally hit in a 1 mile radius, hit 5 liquor stores, but can't buy a piece of fresh fruit, and then you wonder why lawlessness and crime. Like, it's my dog. I don't know if you can hear. She's upset about it too. And he ends with the same sentence he begins with. The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. The next chapter builds upon this in a way that I'm excited to talk about. Hope that you're reading the book. I know it's such a short book, but it's really dense, and it's 118 years old. So there's that. I hope you're watching. Feel free to share. Again, it's free online. It's, you can get the audiobook. You get the audiobook. They actually play the tune that's on in the book. The next chapter is of Booker T. Washington and others. We talked about him a little bit in the first video. It's a really, really, really good conversation on Black conservatism. Anyway, what are your questions? What do you think of this, of the Dying of Freedom? What do you think about the failure of Reconstruction? What were you taught about the Civil War and why it happened? Let me know. I want to know. Take care. Love you so much. Thank you so much, patrons. Race Rage, patreon.com/Race Rage and Fear, or Race Rage Fear. Yeah, we'll have the next video dropping soon. I'd love to hear from you. Let me know what you think. Peace. We have Derek.com, DerekTerry.com, Patreon.com, Race Rage /Race Rage Fear, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and TikTok at Rev Derek Terry. Peace.